Hello and welcome to Airheads, a not-so-serious look at the serious business of royal rumours, gossip and gowns. I'm Tom.
And I'm Maeve.
And we're very excited to bring this special episode to you. We were caught out a bit when we started this podcast. We had no idea what was going to be unfolding in the months ahead. And look what happened. So we thought we'd enlist a little bit of help. And we are delighted to be joined by Shy Charles, tarot reader and astrologer. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm not exactly an astrologer. I just have a keen interest and a decent grasp of astrology, and I think that's the best thing to be looking at for the whole period ahead. But tarot is my main gig when it comes to divination, and it has been for some time. Most people, just to give a bit of background, will know what they would call their star sign is. But really, in astrology, you don't just have one star sign at all. You have every planet in a different sign, and then all sorts of kind of like angles that they make with one another, and you know, what kind of sign did the sun come up in on the horizon of your birthday. All of this kind of like quite complicated stuff has a big impact as well, but that's too complex and too individualized to kind of like put into like a neat section in the newspapers, so it's not something that's very commonly understood. So, but your sun sign is still kind of like the most general oversight of your kind of personality, if you like, and it's still supposed to be the most key one. It's just that when you meet someone who doesn't seem very typical of their sign at all, it could be that they have like loads of stuff in their chart that is kind of overpowering that one. Yeah. Anyone who's interested in the royals and astrology, and why the hell wouldn't you be? It's worth looking at the natal charts of all of these people, because as I say, for the most part, it's very easy to just Google such a body natal chart and they'll come up. Their times of birth are like really accurate and really public, so you can go through for yourself their rising, moon and sun signs. So the sun sign, as I say, is really general. The moon sign is more to do with your inner life and your emotions and how you nurture yourself and your needs. And your rising sign is a look at how you're more of an exterior and a reputation, kind of an action-based kind of area. How do other people see you? Like, I've been fascinated to just kind of like go through this, and like very happy to talk about it, because I would say for the most part, you can talk about confirmation bias and whatever else, but I would say for the most part, these characters, we're kind of unsurprised by their signs, and it's kind of like, it could be useful to just go through some of this, because you've got the Queen is a Taurus, which is that dependability and sometimes stubbornness, with Leo moon, which is kind of like secretly loving the attention, and Virgo rising, which is like needing to be meticulous and organized and disciplined. Like, I'd say that's kind of exactly bang on. And then all of this Cancer in Will's chart, I think, is kind of interesting to see. It's not necessarily what I would have guessed, but I think he's so plain in some ways that it's hard to kind of to think about personality type, because it isn't to say that he has no personality, but he doesn't like, he's quite he seems quite straightforward, shall we say, but a strong Cancer influence could maybe explain some of his discomfort with kind of like reaching out and kind of like connecting to people, because they prefer to just be in their shells. Sometimes it's easy and useful to think of the signs as their actual, you know, like the proud lion or the crab hiding away. And Cancer is the crab. So it's also apparently associated with the archetypical principle of the mother, meaning that the sign embodies nurturing and protective qualities, and a Cancerian's actual mother has a great influence, especially for Cancer men. And that the Sagittarius and Cancer combination is quite a complicated combination. You make the impression of a sociable person and a lover of fun, but deep down you're quite sensitive and would often probably prefer to be alone. So some of the difficulties he maybe seems to have in kind of like bantering perhaps with people, or
seeming interested in what other people have to say.
Yeah, I kind of think that some of that could be there. And then Kate's, I think you might quite like this. So even though we don't have her ascendant to kind of go off, we can't confirm her rising sign, but her Capricorn sun reflects ambition, practicality and discipline. But she's an earth sign, which is quite fitting because of her green-fingered.
Oh, yes.
Her green-fingered kind of side, like, and her love of gardens and how many gardens she's had to design and redesign and all of the rest over the years. So that kind of makes sense. And, of course, Taurus is the earth sign as well. So when she and the Queen go off to the flower shows or whatever it is, that, you know, it maybe isn't just keeping up appearances so much as them both pursuing a very genuine love of the natural world and plants and whatnot. And then for Harry, he is a Virgo. I think that that's becoming perhaps more and more settled in life. Because there have been so many, across this past year, there have been so many times when he has taken a back seat to Meghan or used his own platform to nod to her work or something that she has kind of previously said in a way that seems kind of like, quite kind of like, not exactly surrendering kind of like his position so much in the public eye as kind of like nurturing an understanding of their partnership and what that can be. And I think that's quite Virgo because they're maybe more suited to sometimes working behind the scenes, perhaps because there's a tendency towards anxiousness in this sign. But, you know, it's not a complete constant and you don't want to be kind of like behind the scenes or taking a backseat all the time. I did want to say with regards to the legal case as well, Libra is kind of an important sign when it comes to obtaining legal advice, giving life advice. Like, it's symbolized by, like, Libras do have a keen sense of justice and wanting to enforce or restore justice where they can. In Meghan's chart, there's like tons of Libra there. And I think Libra traits are just kind of like, maybe the most negative thing you could say about them is that they can sometimes be a little self-pitying, but generally I think that's quite a well thought of sign. When you're looking at memes on Instagram or whatever, you hardly ever see people being like, oh, I'm never dating another Libra in my life or whatever. Because they're kind of like fair and also stylish is important. Style is important for Libras, so I guess we've seen that borne out many times. But yeah, they're often to be found in the legal professions, and if they're not in the legal professions, there's still that way of thinking and that kind of like maybe those inclinations. So although this case could be quite stressful for her, I also feel like in her chart it looks as though she might feel quite at home. Like, she's not a fish out of water when it comes to thinking in these ways and dealing with these types of, you know, with kind of like mounting a case against immediate giants.
Yeah.
It'll obviously could be quite fraught, but I don't think she's out of her comfort zone as such in that process. So that's
what
worth
drew
thinking
her
about.
to Suits as well.
Quite. No, there's some. I looked up just some other people's thoughts on the specific combination of being a Leo sun with Cancer rising, I think, and there was a lot to do with drama and a love of drama and a skill for acting. So that's, yeah, this is what I mean. Most of these people, they really are quite good examples of their natal charts, and they don't really seem to buck the interpretation that would be given to them. I was kind of surprised to see Charles was a Scorpio, a little bit, because everyone thinks of Scorpios as so sexy and dangerous. But
Yeah, so what's the problem?
Yeah, exactly. So then I just remembered how sexy and dangerous he was. Basically, it was a knee-jerk response to the fact that yeah, he obviously is deeply sexy and dangerous, or certainly has been. And he has that moon in Taurus, which is kind of like, yeah, they all just have like quite a bit of showing off and quite a bit of like earth and nature loving green fingeredness. There's just even more of this in Charles's chart. Of course.
Will you do Camilla?
Well, she's not so different, as I've said, from Harry. She's got Sun in Cancer, Moon in Cancer, and Leo rising. Leo's like a good time, fairly comfortable being kind of like the centre of attention. They're warm towards other people, but they can be quite... They're a lazy lion. It's a male lion. Leo is like a male lion, so it's not like the huntress. It's like the one who just like lies in the sun and is quietly in charge.
Well, the sexy scorpion scuttles around.
Yeah. Exactly.
As we are approaching a new year with 2020 ahead of us, we wanted to ask Shai to come and join us to talk a little bit about what the year holds for all the senior royals. So I know you've been looking through their charts and stuff. What's the main takeaway for 2020?
I think that we can look forward to quite a turbulent year with a lot of fairly exciting royal news. That's kind of the main takeaway. So I think it could be quite a tricky time for the Queen and perhaps for Prince William. I thought that we could look at the Uranus transit of Taurus. Now, the Queen is a Taurus. Taurus overall are people who, it's an earth sign, so they're quite steadfast, often quite stubborn, very interested in their own environment and more broadly in the natural environment, and very kind of like earthy people, quite loyal people, maybe to their detriment, which we can perhaps sometimes see.
Yeah.
Too honourable.
Too honourable. We have Uranus transiting Taurus at the moment, and I think that, broadly speaking, is quite a difficult period for the Queen. It's also very slow, so the further away a planet is from the sun, more or less, the slower their cycle is. And this period began in 2018, and it's going to continue until 2026.
Wow.
And it's difficult because Uranus is a very kind of like individualistic and possibly quite chaotic planet that kind of likes to shake things up a little bit. And Taurus is kind of like this steadfast, dependable sign. So to have Uranus in Taurus is tricky, and it's associated with a period of kind of like innovation through difficulty, like a lot of change to do with the earth. So conversations about climate and green energy and off-grid living are supposed to be kind of like very much in the zeitgeist at the time when Uranus transits Taurus. But also it kind of like can shake up financial markets and all sorts of stuff like this as well. And a planet's retrograde period is when it appears to be going backwards as part of an optical illusion from the earth, because astrology is not where the planets truly are, but how they appear to be when we look up at the sky. And so Uranus retrograde in Taurus is supposed to be a little bit of a break for the Queen. It's supposed to be a little bit of a breather in amongst this otherwise quite difficult period. I think it's lasted a few months, and it turns direct again on January, so she doesn't have much longer.
That's so interesting, because she, as we know, the Queen heads up to Sandringham for her Christmas break, and she always stays there until February, which is the anniversary of her father's death. So she is gearing up for this break,
yes.
But it doesn't sound like it's going to be very relaxing.
Well, I think it'll be relaxing until kind of like mid-January. That's how it's looking. So it'll be a good time to identify the right support team to wade through difficult times.
It's way overdue.
Yeah. And thinking about groups and friendships you associate with and what kind of motivates you. So it's kind
Could
of...
this be to do with Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely somebody as well who needs to be looking at his team and looking at who he associates with.
Yeah, I've got a little bit to say about Andrew. He's got a lot of Mars in his chart. So that might not surprise people who have a grasp on what Mars is to do with, which is kind of impulsive, god of war, kind of like occasionally like aggressive, destructive type energies it could be. And he has got a lot of Mars in his chart, and there's a Mars retrograde this year in the autumn.
What does that mean?
Well, I think what it's going to mean is a particularly testing time for him. And what makes it all the more interesting is what house it occurs in. Mars retrograde is September 9th to November 13th in 2020. So this is when we need to be looking out for difficult news that might be facing Prince Andrew.
More difficult than the news he's having at the moment.
Well, it might not be more difficult, but it will be perhaps a resurgence. Okay. So maybe we'll not exactly lose interest, not the likes of Airhead listeners, but like overall, perhaps we've learned as much as we're going to learn for the time being about the Epstein controversy and Andrew's like disastrous interactions with the press and things like that. I feel like he will probably be lying low, but there will be a resurgence of these stories, whether that's because of kind of like a new information coming from like victims or witnesses of some kind, or whether, he puts his foot in it in some way, or whether there could even be kind of like a progression of the state of things legally with, his standing and maybe having to... I don't know whether that's likely to occur so far along as like next autumn, but, these investigations are complicated.
Wait that long. But that does make sense in terms of like court procedure. Like it probably will be that long. Yeah,
it doesn't happen overnight, does it? And so he's got his moon in Scorpio, which is a Mars-ruled planet. He's got his midheaven in Aries, which is a Mars-ruled planet. And there are lots of kind of Mars aspects in his natal chart that just means that even though that's not his main sign, I think it will be tricky for him. It's a time of frustration and anger and a sense of progress being blocked, but it happens in his 10th house. And that is to do with reputation, public image, attitude to authority, status, occupation, everything like that.
It makes so much sense.
Yeah, everything that's been disrupted by this story and everything that has been, changed in, the royal family and his kind of like withdrawing from public life and everything. This is exactly where you would expect to see that type of activity, and it kind of flares up again in the autumn. So I don't know exactly what will occur, but I think that this story will probably be back, and it will be bad news for him and compelling and worrying news for everybody else.
Could this have something to do with Charles gaining more power? and ostracizing him even further.
Yeah, I think because of this fact that it's to do with status and kind of blocks in the road and kind of frustrations, I think it could be, as a result of that story, there's kind of like a jostling for influence, or, you know, obviously we understand that the Queen has this kind of like evergreen soft spot for Andrew, but it might be that, you know, there's a real clash around that and around kind of status, you know, in the...
Well, because Charles definitely doesn't have that soft spot, so if he's kind of pushing for a bit more
clout,
territory.
Yeah.
Intriguing.
Yeah, it could be kind of a territorial... It's also... Mars is a very kind of like... It's kind of god of war, territorial, male energy. So like a kind of jostling among brothers for kind of like what you might inherit or how you might further yourself is exactly what it's to do with. But it seems like it will be more of a source of frustration on Andrew's side than anyone else's.
In terms of jostling brothers, do you have anything on Harry?
Yeah. So I don't think that, of all of the royals, I think that Harry perhaps won't be having quite the craziest of years. But Harry and Meghan both have Venus-ruled signs.
Does that mean love?
Yeah, it's everything to do with everything to do with kind of like love and connection and relationships. Also a lot to do with kind of like how you might nurture things in life. So Harry's got a Venus-ruled moon sign, and so does Meghan. And Venus is going to be having its retrograde cycle between May 13 and June 20th. So looking further ahead into the summer, and this is happening in the sign of Gemini. So Venus retrograde in Gemini. How will this affect Meghan and Harry? Well, this is happening, it starts off happening in Harry's 6th house. And it says that he might struggle then to feel as though he's receiving his daily due and proper attention, and maybe struggling to identify and ask for what it is that he truly wants in different situations. So that sounds potentially quite challenging. But when Venus stations direct again at the end of this time, that happens in Harry's 5th house. And there's the idea then that he will grow in confidence to pick up pace and kind of like identify what he needs a bit better, and maybe start a project that has a bit more, maybe the beginning of a new project that he's like particularly excited and passionate about.
Well, I was going to say, I wonder how this aligns with the timeline on the Oprah project.
Yeah.
If he's looking for
his
a bit
TV
more...
show with Apple.
I don't know anything about it.
Harry and Oprah are making a sort of docu-series to do with mental health for Apple TV Plus. So that's been in the works for like a year. Mm-hmm. And Will actually is also doing a separate project, a mental health TV series. So there's going to be some competition there, I think. But we are due this Oprah and Harry program next year.
For God's sake. Well, in that case, that sounds like it could be something that is relevant to this, because, yeah, it's to do with kind of like the beginning of a cycle on a project that he will not see as being like humdrum or restricting, or where he takes a back seat or whatever. Which isn't to say that I think he's kind of like permanently feeling that way, but kind of around May time, I think he might be feeling like somewhat listless, or like not the center of attention, or just not making himself, not perhaps being dynamic enough. And then that will finish towards the end of that time in June. So it's a short period of kind of like working out what to do next, and then kind of like coming back fighting. But overall, you know, not a disaster to speak of. And for Meghan, in the same time, I mean, they're likely to be affected in some quite similar ways. Meghan's, I think, is more to do with like interpersonal relationships. So it's a bit more kind of literal in terms of like who takes up space in your life, and like, is that the right thing? And by the time Venus goes direct for her, which will be happening in her 11th house, that's all to do with acquaintances, social networks, and one's kind of place in the world. So there's some reassessment along those lines. It's kind of all to do with like knowing who your real friends are and who maybe are the snakes. Yeah.
Is this going to be Jessica Mulroney moving into Frogmore House?
I think this might have something to do with the lawsuit and the role that her dad and her friends and all the people that are going to be involved in that.
In the release of the letter and everything.
Yeah.
It could be to do with like looking at who will be loyal to her throughout that kind of process, I suppose, as it's all kind of like being prepared and things are kind of being, you know, evidenced and funded and discussed, and you know, a lot of this stuff is going to be quite sensitive, I suppose, and some people maybe will feel like they're doing the wrong thing by pursuing this line of action in the first place. So it's to do with like knowing who your friends are, and there being some really real like changes in that regard. But I also think that she will be able to, and probably will choose to, actually not sever ties with anyone. It's maybe more of a private kind of like weighing up kind of like who your real allies are, but not necessarily kind of burning bridges, you know, because you know that you still may have to come back to face some of these people again, like further down the line. So I don't know how whether this will filter into like public life and kind of like what we see too much, because I think she might be wise enough to kind of like perhaps keep her cards closer to her chest in this area. And this is kind of what I mean about things not necessarily being that dramatic for that couple, at least perhaps not until more the winter time when it all really kicks off.
Wow.
And what about the other couple? What are their names again?
The other couple. The other young royals. Kate and Will.
Yes, Kate and Will. Interestingly, we don't know so much about Kate astrologically as we do any of these other people, because for a very simple
woman of mystery.
She's a woman of mystery. There's quite a mundane reason for that, which is that we don't know what time of day she was born. Whereas for all of the other people, it's you know, somewhere in the public record or online or whatever. Especially people who were born into the royal family, it would have been in the papers that such a body had this baby and they weighed this much and they had it at this time. So it's very easy to pull up all of this kind of quite rich information astrologically about people who had always been in the royal family. And it is as well about Meghan, in fact, even though she doesn't have that royal background.
I can imagine her making that very public just to invite people to do her charts.
Yeah, but you know, like if she has this kind of like Californian like hippie type background, and maybe it's astrologers who already know this and are kind of like sharing it in amongst each other as part, you know, secrets of the guild. But yeah, basically we know what time of day she was born, so that means that we can determine her ascendant and her rising sign, which means we know where all of her houses are, and it's all just a bit more of a fuller picture. It's not that we don't know anything about Kate, but we don't know her rising sign, only her sun and her moon sign. As well as there being a lot of Leo in the royal family, there's a lot of Cancer as well. And they are, well, I suppose typically like very emotional signs, very caring, quite private, home, like loving, very much like home loving and like inward focused. Will and Camilla both have Cancer moon and Cancer rising signs, so they're both like double Cancer, which is like, it's not unheard of. There are only 12 signs, so you know you're gonna come across this sometimes, but it's interesting nevertheless. And actually their sun signs aren't a million miles away from one another either, I would say. Will is Sun in Cancer, Moon in Cancer, and Sagittarius rising, and Camilla is Sun in Cancer, Moon in Cancer, and Leo rising. So she's got Leo rising, he's got Sag rising. They're not exactly the same, Leo and Sagittarius, obviously, but I kind of think that they're quite similar people. But then perhaps historically, you know, their similarity has bred difficulties between the two of them. Yeah, conflict. Because sometimes
he explains Camilla's beautiful mane of hair.
Ah, that's right. Yeah, it does. You may be being a little tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of astrologers do think that like physical appearance can be impacted by your star sign, and Leos are supposed to have stunning heads of hair. It's just a fact, like a lion's mane. Whether or not we take it with a pinch of salt, it does explain that up to a point. Anyway, there's a lot of eclipses next year that are to do with Sagittarius, and I think that this will shake things up in the Cambridge household more than others. Cancer and Sagittarius. So the first one that I think is useful to look at is on June 5th, and that's a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. So this affects Will's kind of rising sign, which is maybe more to do with his like public image and more kind of like obvious things about him, the sorts of things that people talk about and people know. And Sagittarius is all to do with kind of like not wanting to be tied down. This is happening in his 12th house. So I think it could be a little destructive. I think modern astrology tries not to be too doom and gloom, but I think in previous centuries, the 12th house is sort of you know, how you undo yourself, or what are your fatal kind of flaws, or
Dear.
yeah. So he's got a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius, this quite impulsive sign in a way, and it's occurring in his kind of like house where you can, you know, make poor decisions, or you can kind of like harm your own outlook. And it's a lot to do with kind of like escapism. So Sagittarius in the first place are signs that like to explore and don't like to be tied down. And this eclipse is happening in a house that is to do with kind of retreating and escaping. So it's to do with, what is your escape? Like, do you read? Do you like play music? Are you an alcoholic? It doesn't have to be such a wholesome thing, but like everyone maybe has their way of retreating and kind of like into their own world. And I think this will be quite a relevant...
Do you have affairs?
Do you have affairs? Quite, yeah. And I think that it could be, well, it says here that it could be quite literal. So how people withdraw like from everyday life in terms of like hospitals, prisons, retreats. So I think it could be something to do with like either being or visiting kind of like a patient, or someone who like kind of like exists in one of these like quite cloistered spaces. And I think that it's going to be, him kind of like wanting to kind of explore and having some of these frustrations around kind of like feeling tied down, or wanting to kind of like have fun. And I think that, side eye.
Much fun.
And then there's a solar eclipse in Cancer, which I think will affect Will and Camilla both a lot, because they have all of this Cancer that we've talked about in their charts. So it's a new moon solar eclipse in Cancer, and it's supposed to be pretty settling in some ways. Like, how do you make a change when you're not happy? Is it to do with like vacating a premises, like leaving a partner? Is, you know, now that's what it's to do with generally, because like I say, it's like directing your attention to your own like emotional security, but they're in very different places for Camilla and Will. So for Camilla, it's in a house to do with humanitarian and political efforts.
Oh, wow.
Ooh.
So I kind of think that this could be to do with like a new patronage, or a new cause, or a new cruise ship.
Definitely.
Or something like that. So this is kind of midsummer, June 21st. Or I think it could be something a little more private, but it's something to do with like her principles, or something that she's, you know, believes in, or decided as part of this event that she's, you know, got a growing interest in. Could it be that she kind of like feels emotionally lighter, and as I said, caters to her emotional needs by getting something off her chest? Like perhaps there's been a matter of disagreement in terms of like politics or something with Charles. Like maybe they've got differing views about Brexit, or who knows what. Whether, even if it's a bit private, maybe kind of like champion, you know, something a little bit that's a new thing for her.
I feel like it's very unlikely that we see... Well, it's very unheard of almost that we see Camilla seek extra work. So...
But it might happen anyway. I don't know. Maybe something will be... Maybe, I don't know. Maybe she'll have to be the patron of something that Prince Andrew used to be the patron of.
Definitely. Or take on something else from the Queen.
Yeah. And then that could be something that like there's a little bit of media around, and that, you know, gradually becomes more associated with her than it has been before. Mm-hmm. But I think, she'll have a new string in her bow of some sort.
I'm so excited for that.
But I don't know, actually, if we look at what this time is about, and it's Cancer, and it's all to do with like emotional needs being kind of like, you know, having quite a difficult look at them. And I don't think if you just get handed someone else's work that they used to do, that's necessarily going to kind of like be... I think it's more something that comes from within, you know, it's kind of perhaps quite self-driven.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
Not words we would typically associate with. We'll be looking out for this.
Yeah. So midsummer, that's when this will occur.
But there are a lot of like village fetes and kind of things where you
at
can
that time
do
of year.
tastings. We know she loves, you know,
chutneys and
tiny
cheeses.
cubes of cheese.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she might just really commit to like a new kind of a new delicacy in that area.
Starting her own CBD oil venture.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
CBD oil.
She has her
That
own
could be
money.
it, you know. Yeah. Maybe she just really does want everyone to be getting on that medical cannabis, and I mean, that really wouldn't be something that I'm sure she could like whisper in Charles's ear about that. Like he's kind of like quite green and quite this, you know.
Yeah.
By the time Charles is the king, I'm pretty sure that there probably will be a bit more of that around anyway. Like,
well, he's going to need to devote half of his duchy estate to the growing of cannabis before he has to hand it over to Will. 'Cause I feel like Will wouldn't be as chill about it.
What? So he's kind of creating a poison chalice in all of the land that he owns. Yeah, I think we've got it. Yeah, Camilla. In June, Camilla's going to become even more devoted to the many benefits of cannabis for medical and recreational purposes.
She does have a honey that they sell in Fortnum's in the summer, so perhaps Fortnum's will start to sell
her own strain.
The Duchess of Cornwall's
space honey. Yeah, it's something like that anyway. But Will's, I think, this is like slightly juicier. This eclipse for him is in the house of marriage. So, and it can be to do with like upheavals in big and very significant relationships, kind of like looking at who you are in the relationship for better or for worse, and who are you going to become as part of, a partnership that you're in. They can be to do with, an eclipse like this could be to do with an identity crisis. It could mean going through the ending of a relationship or a kind of break on a relationship. And then also this idea of retreats came up again. So I don't know if this is kind of like a long-term... I'll kind of come on to this, but I can almost see something to do with property in this, actually. Like he is trying to get somewhere that can be a retreat. Maybe not even just for him, but for the family as a whole. Because there's something... The final of these eclipses in December is back in Sagittarius, so this has less to do with Camilla and more just to do with like Will's own stuff. And it's kind of like a new beginning, possibly a trip that is really important for him, and possibly it's in his 12th house, which is the natural house of Pisces, and I think it could be to do with like a place by the sea. I don't know if they already have one.
No, they borrow his friend's property in Mustique every summer, but maybe he'll get his own place there like Princess Margaret had.
Yeah, I think it could well be something like this, because this Pisces influence is all to do with being near the ocean. It's like the sign of the ocean, and people who want to be near the sea, kind of like there's a lot of activity kind of in this house. And we've seen with both of the other eclipses something to do with like wanting to get away and possibly feeling a bit tied down. There's marriage trouble in summer, big time. Like really reassessing their attitudes towards one another. Won't necessarily end in disaster, because perhaps almost some of this kind of like planning that he's doing to kind of like how can he healthily channel some of his like maybe some of his impulsive kind of urges, or some of his kind of like not dominant but still nevertheless there, like possibly slightly irresponsible behaviors. Maybe they can like hash that out and work out how it can be like, how it can kind of like exist within a structure, or how it can almost have a place to go.
It makes so much sense looking back over some of Will's behaviour. Like, even if you look back at the kind of waiting period that Kate had to endure, that he had this like almost home set up for him. He knew he could come back to Kate, and he went off dating other people, questing for fair maidens across the land.
Yes.
But he knew he kind of had this home set up waiting for him, maybe.
Oh, I'd kind of forgot. I mean, like I've forgotten those kind of like stories and that element of his kind of dating and relationship history. But that really rings true insofar as, a Cancer is comforted by kind of like that home comfort and what they can go back to and what they have. But his Sagittarius kind of like, kind of somewhat flicking between the two. And I think if we've seen that in the past, it's almost as though that hasn't quite gone away, in spite of the image that we might be being fed. And obviously with his rumoured affair and all of this sort of stuff, like it's kind of come to a head, and it's something that is, a very poorly kept secret. And I think there's probably still some fallout from that in 2020, and still some animosity between the two of them, but maybe they're looking at new ways of coping with it, and it could be to do with like buying a house or a castle or a palace or something like that.
I think it's safe to assume that Kate's next garden won't have a rose in it.
But in the end, Will always come home and lay his head on Carol Middleton's lap. That's the most important thing. Is there anything else about Kate, or do we want to move on to...
Well, there's a bit less about her because of this business of... I mean, there's just like a bit more drama elsewhere. I kind of think that, for people who are interested in kind of supposed competition between, or comparisons between, or friendships between her and Meghan. I don't know what there is in terms of like great big events on that front, but people might be interested to know that they have the same moon sign, Kate and Meghan. And again, it could be maybe a case like we've seen with, I've decided that we've seen with Will and Camilla, where their similarities maybe can be almost a challenge. But they both have a Libra moon, which is to say Libras are quite balanced and fair people for the most part. But when they are kind of like riled by something, they can show that anger quite coolly and be quite cold. And it can be to do with like distance between them and the person that they have a problem with. And I don't know, of course, really, like, do they have a problem with each other? And if so, like, how severe is it? But I think you can almost see two people here who are quite conflict averse, actually. Yeah. And so where conflict might be taking place, especially actually maybe more between the brothers than the two of them, where there's conflict, the response that they will both go to, I think, is to avoid and to create a distance and to maybe cool off. And if they both do that, then that kind of almost doubles the divide that you kind of like then see between them. So it kind of remains to be seen, I suppose, how some of that will unfold. Meghan's chart overall shows probably quite a caring person because she's a Leo sun. And although Leos can be maybe a bit showy-offy or whatever, like we see that throughout this kind of like whole family, she's still Cancer and Libra as her other two important signs. And that's quite like nurturing, caring, fair person. So it could be, in fact, that she would be an ideal person to support Kate through some of Will's Sagittarius, recklessness. And yet we don't see that because of more historical or deeper animosities between Will and Harry, and because neither of them will chase the other one to say, let's sort this out, because they're both afraid of fighting. Maybe another kind of way to kind of like summarize the year is that for the most part the drama seems to be occurring at the end, apart from in the Cambridge household when the summer's more serious. Something's going to be happening, though, on the 21st December. So in about a year's time, we will see for the first time in about 20 years the Great Conjunction, which is when Saturn and Jupiter go into the same sign. And it's a time of a lot of upheaval because it's almost like magnetically different forces. Jupiter's all about exuberance and growth, spending, success, being dizzied by progress, and Saturn is all about like tripping yourself up or deliberately limiting yourself or being organized or trying to contain something. So, they're kind of opposed, and I think that's why it's such a fuss when they join forces in the same sign. But Meghan has got a natal Great Conjunction, which it means to say that this was the state of affairs when she was born.
Oh, wow.
So I feel as though she perhaps has kind of an affinity with this period or this astrological event. And I don't necessarily think it predicts great things for her so much as it's generally seen to be as a time of quite a lot of social and political upheaval, especially for those at the top. There's all kinds of interesting kind of myth and magic surrounding this event, including the idea that the Star of Bethlehem, in a very festive reference, was this astrological event. So it was Saturn or Jupiter kind of like in the sky as some kind of like astrological theory about that having happened. And the other big thing about it is that according to financial astrologer Daniel Ferreira, whenever there's a great conjunction during an election or inaugural year, the president is likely to die in office. And that seems to have happened fairly steadfastly across modern history. Now, I don't know how likely that is anyway. You'd need like a clever statistician to be like, well, presidents are old men and, they tend to serve for however long. So the likelihood of them kicking the bucket while they are president is not exactly going to be unheard of or whatever. But interestingly, where that hasn't occurred, the one or two times when that hasn't occurred and the president hasn't died, there have been assassination attempts kind of instead during this time or linked with the Great Conjunction. And I just wonder, given we know the US election is November, the Great Conjunction is December 21st, like what we might expect to see for Trump or whoever else, it's going to be massive news either way. And that seems only to be confirmed and borne out in this kind of particular astrological timing. And I just wonder also, with Meghan being an American woman, you know, how she could perhaps be linked to some of this in a time that's already, you know, likely to be a bit trying with everything that she has going on legally, as she'll be in the press quite a lot alongside some of these emerging stories. And I kind of, my instinct would be that perhaps she struggles to remain as impartial as the firm would like about US events. That's kind of how I could see it playing out, and how she kind of like comes into this story a little bit.
Could she even be living in America at that point, given all we've heard about how Harry and Meghan are possibly going to set up a house in California?
Sure, yeah. No, that kind of could be to do with like almost like our kind of homecoming, the same way that these planets are coming back to how they were when she was born. It's also possibly quite a pioneering. I think this great conjunction is happening in Aquarius. Saturn goes into Aquarius March 21st. And in the same way that I was saying, like, Uranus in Taurus is a bit strange, I think Saturn in Aquarius possibly like a bit tumultuous as well, because Aquarius, Princess Diana was an Aquarius. Aquarians are supposed to be forward thinking, tons to do with like social consciousness, social justice, that sort of thing. And we know Meghan kind of like wears her heart on her sleeve and has those types of leanings as well in terms of social justice, feminism and the like, which will be being all talked about a lot in November and December next year. Yeah. So it's hard to pin down exactly kind of like what might unfold, because this is kind of just this big astrological event that lasts for quite a long time, because Saturn moves quite slowly. But I think it could be big for everybody, and especially the Queen, because she's just is the boss, and for Meghan because of her kind of link to it in her natal chart.
I'm so happy to hear, though, that Meghan, more than maybe some other people, could thrive in this period of tumultuous chaos.
Yeah.
Because she needs everything on her side with the legal proceedings going on. So that gives me some hope.
Do you think she's going to formally endorse Bernie Sanders? Is that her response? She can't stay impartial any longer. She has to do a video on Sussex Royal.
Well, it would almost be something like that, or maybe something a couple of rungs below that. But I think that could be part of her dilemma and part of the eventfulness of that time next year. Yeah.
We'll put a Bernie quote on the Sussex Royal Instagram.
From what we've kind of heard, what are you most troubled by and excited by for 2020 with all of our new astrological knowledge?
Well, for me, it's definitely the stuff around Will, and whether the rumoured affair is going to kind of come back into the spotlight, or if it's going to have some repercussions. Like, I would be very excited to see what happens with that.
Yeah, so look out for it and make sure it doesn't go under the radar.
We can plan our holidays around these busy periods.
Yeah, it's midsummer, so that's Will's,
Just like it was midsummer this year as well. Yeah, I'm fascinated with Andrew and the Queen and how that's going to overlap, and how her worries aren't over yet. We could be facing another crisis for the monarchy caused by Andrew this time next year.
Yes.
So maybe you'll come back and join us at that point to
recap.
recap.
And to look at well, I'd be only too happy to. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Not at all.
Going over all this fascinating.
It's really been a pleasure. I'm such a fan of Airheads, and I can't believe I am now an Airhead.
Do you want to share your social handles?
Sure, yeah. I do talk about tarot and astrology quite a bit on social media, and you can find me on Instagram, Shy Charles, like how you would spell shy, the synonym of timid, and how you would spell Charles as in Prince Charles. All one word. And I'm also on the Twitter, Shy Charles, except with an underscore, Shy_Charles. So see you there.
Fantastic. You can find Airheads on Instagram and Twitter at AirheadsPod, and on Facebook at Airheads.
And if you like this episode, you can rate and review us wherever you get your podcast, or maybe even tell a friend. And we'll see what comes to pass.
2020. See you next year.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Together we shall cast ourselves into the future.